In 1485, England saw the end of the Middle Ages, although people at the time didn't realize it. Before looking at the changes in England under the House of Tudor, it might be worth looking back at some of the main social developments that had taken place at that time. Society was structured by rank, with dukes, earls, and other lords at the top, though there were fewer of them due to wars. Below them were the knights, who had shifted from warriors to gentlemen farmers or landed gentry. This group expanded because even yeoman farmers could become knights if they had a certain income. Many squires who had served knights in earlier times now became knights themselves. Below the gentry were the freemen in town, who could gain freedom and control town life after working in craft guild for 7 years. Town offered opportunities for poor men to become rich, like the famous Dick Whittington, who rose from a poor boy to Lord Mayor of London. Whittington was actually the son of a knight. He was probably an example of the growing practice of the landed families of sending younger sons to town to join a merchant or craft guild. Over time, the lines between the landed gentry and town merchants blurred, as landed families sent younger sons to join merchant guilds and merchants were beginning to overlap. Guilds were initially created to protect trades of the whole town, later became exclusive as poorer families did not have the money or family connections to become members of the guilds. The poorer workers tried to join together to protect their own interests. These were the first efforts to form a trade union. Several times in the 14th century, skilled workers tried unsuccessfully to protect themselves against the power of the guilds. A new force in the national economy appears. The national merchant organizations began to replace town guilds, establishing trade factories in Europe and controlling exports. During the 14th century, a number of English merchants established trading stations, factories in different places in Europe. The merchant organizations became important at a national level and began to replace the old town guilds as the most powerful trading institutions. In the countryside, wages rose and food was plentiful, but problems loomed as land was increasingly used for sheep farming instead of food crops, and also because rich and powerful sheep farmers started to fence in land which had always been used by other villagers, leading to social and economic issues. Meanwhile, a new middle class emerged in towns. The more successful lawyers, merchants, cloth manufacturers, exporters, squires, gentlemen, and yeoman farmers were increasingly forming a single class of people. This middle class could be described as the literate class. The growth of this new middle class, educated and skilled in law, administration, and trade, formed a unified class with interest in both town and country, fostering a new literate and creating a new atmosphere in Britain. This literate class began questioning the church and state, supporting religious reforms and rejecting serfdom and feudalism for being unchristian and economically inefficient. During this time, Parliament development marked a new relationship between the middle class and the king. Edward I invited knights and merchants to parliaments because they could provide money. When Edward III asked for money, Parliament wanted to see the royal accounts. This was the first time a king was accountable to Parliament. Merchants and country gentlemen were very anxious to influence the king's policies to protect their interests, like when they supported Edward III's war with France to protect the whole trade. Under Edward III, Parliament split into two parts, the Lords and the Commons, which represented the middle class. Only commoners with an income of 40 shillings or more could be members, leaving the poor with no representation. The alliance between squires and merchants made Parliament stronger and separated the commons from the lord. In England, unlike other European countries, the end of feudalism strengthened the House of Commons. Another change was that kings had been taking law cases from local lord courts since the 12th century. By the middle of 14th century, local lord courts were gone. In 1363, Edward III appointed the Justices of the Peace to handle smaller crimes and hold court 4 times a year. These Justices of the Peace were usually lesser lord or landed gentry, chosen for their fairness and honesty. The Justices of Peace made by the middle class stronger and replaced the nobility as local authorities. During the Wars of the Roses, nobles used their armies to influence Justices of the Peace and judges. But this was the last time the nobility tried to overpower the king. Justices of the Peace remained the main form of local government in the countryside until 1888.
Condition of women. Little is known about the life of women, but without doubt it was hard. The church taught that women should obey their husbands. It also spread two very different ideas about women: that they should be pure and holy, like the Virgin Mary, and that, like Eve, they could not be trusted and were moral danger to men. Marriage was usually the single most important event in the lives of men and women. The decision itself was made by the family because by marriage a family could improve its wealth and social position. Once married, a woman had to accept her husband as her master. A disobedient wife was usually beaten. The first duty of every wife was to give her husband children, preferably sons. Producing children was dangerous and exhausting because so many children died as babies, and because there was a little that could be done if a birth went wrong. The wife of a noble had other responsibilities. When the Lord was away, she was in charge of the manor and the village lands. She also had to defend the manor if it was attacked. She had to run the household, welcome visitors, and store enough food, including salted meat, for winter. She was expected to have enough knowledge of herbs and plants to make suitable medicines for those in the village who were sick. She had little time for her own children. Most women were peasants, busy making food, making cloth, and making clothes for the cloth. They work in the fields, look after the children, the geese, the pigs, and the sheep, made the cheese, and grew the vegetables. A woman's position improved if her husband died. She could get control of the money her family had given the husband at the time of marriage. She might have to marry again. Men wanted her land, and it was difficult to look after it without the help of a man. Language and culture. With the spread of literacy, cultural life in Britain naturally developed also. In the cities, plays were performed at important religious festivals. They were called mystery plays because of the mysterious nature of events in the Bible, and they were a popular form of culture. The language itself was changing. French had been used less and less. In the 14th century, Edward III had actually forbidden the speaking of French in his army. By the end of the 14th century, however, English was once again a written language because it was being used instead of French by the ruling literate class. But Middle English, the language of the 14th and 15th centuries, was very different from Anglo-Saxon because it had borrowed so much from Norman French. Two writers helped in the rebirth of English literature. One was William Langland. Those poem, Piers Plowman, gives a powerful description of the times in which he lived. The other, Geoffrey Chaucer, his most famous work was The Canterbury Tales, written at the end of the 14th century. The Canterbury Tales describe a group of pilgrims traveling from London to the tomb of Thomas Becket at Canterbury, a common religious act in England in the Middle Ages. During the journey, each character tells a story. Collections of stories were popular at this time because almost all literature, unlike today, was written to be read out aloud. The stories themselves are not Chaucer's own. He used old stories but rewrote them in an interesting and amusing way. By the end of the Middle Ages, education developed enormously during the 15th century, and many schools were founded by powerful men. One of these was William Wickham, Bishop of Winchester and Lord Chancellor of England, who founded both Winchester School in 1382 and New College, Oxford. Henry VI later foundations at Eton and Cambridge. Many other schools were also opened because there was a growing need for educated people who could administer the government. Clerks started grammar schools where students could learn the skills of reading and writing. These schools offered their pupils a future in the church or the civil service, or at the universities of Oxford and Cambridge. The Middle Ages ended with a major technical development. William Caxton's first English printing press, set up in 1476. At first, he printed popular books such as Chaucer's Canterbury Tales and Malory's Morte d'Arthur. Caxton's printing press was dramatic for his age. Books became cheaper and more plentiful, as the quicker printing process replaced slow and expensive copywriting by hand. Caxton's press provided books for the newly educated people of the 15th century and encouraged literacy.